Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Eternalism Weighs In. My name is David, and the title of this podcast is Unmasking Postmormonism and the Faith Crisis Movement. This is Episode 4. As promised, the second of our two inoculations will consist in our understanding historicity. It is our argument that Latter-day Saints gaining at least a minimal understanding of historicity as an academic discipline is one of the best ways to inoculate the saints from a post-Mormon-induced faith crisis. We will explain why shortly, but for now, keep in mind that safeguarding our families from this post-Mormon-induced faith crisis is the very purpose for our creating this series of episodes on unmasking postmormonism and the faith crisis movement. So let's get started by asking a few questions. In this episode, we'll address 4 common questions that our viewers have raised based on previous episodes. These questions are: what's the difference between history and historicity, and why should we care? Why all the fuss about church history, and why the emphasis on understanding historicity? Why not inoculate all the Latter-day Saints from this post-Mormon-induced faith crisis by simply turning us all into church history buffs? And lastly, why are many Latter-day Saints not concerned with post-Mormonism or its attack on church history? The first question that is often raised is this: what's the difference between history and historicity, and why should we care? Now, this is a very intriguing question, so stick with us because the answers might surprise you. Whenever I think of history, I always think of it as cooked sausage. I told you that you might be surprised, but whenever I pick up an historical work and sit down to read it, the first thing I do is remind myself that no matter how juicy, spicy, and tasty this historical work may turn out to be, it is still cooked sausage. On the other hand, I think of historicity as the sausage factory, in that it is often a messy, unpleasant, and unrewarding business at times. And yet, without the sausage factory, where sausage is made, there would be no golden brown sausages sizzling in the frying pan. This, then, answers the first question as to the distinction between history and historicity, with history being the cooked sausage and historicity the sausage factory. Now let's turn to the second question: why should anyone care? We have all heard it said that if we really knew how the sausage was made, we wouldn't have anything to do with it, let alone eat it. Well, historicity is how the sausage gets made, and when it comes to the history books that we purchase, it is important to remember that fact, because as every health inspector knows, all kinds of things can go wrong at the sausage factory. For the health inspector, then, there are many areas of concern within a sausage factory. And within each general area of concern, there is a checkoff list of particular items. The same is true of historicity as an academic discipline. Later in this episode, we will be mentioning 3 specific areas of concern. First, its problematic nature, because it is subject to error. Secondly, its probabilistic nature, because it is subject to a sliding scale of being more or less probable. And thirdly, its provisional nature, because it is subject to change. Now, the reason why we should care about the difference between history and historicity is the same reason we should care about the difference between the sausage we purchase and fry up in our frying pans and the sausage factory where this sausage is made. That is, you need to be aware of the quality of the meat you are buying, just as you need to be aware of the quality of the history books you are reading. And while the meat we purchase might be FDA approved, the historical works we read are mainly policed by peer reviews or critical claims to be found on the back jacket of an historical work. In both cases, however, it is buyer beware, hence the importance of taking historicity as an academic discipline seriously, as well as the precautionary warnings every reader of an historical work should keep in mind when assessing its historical authenticity, and which we will be discussing in coming episodes. As Latter-day Saints, then, we need to inform ourselves and our families of this important distinction between history and historicity, between cooked sausage and the sausage factory, This means that every time you pick up an historical work and are presented with an historical narrative, you must remind yourself that this is cooked sausage and that the quality or historical authenticity of that cooked sausage is greatly dependent upon the sausage factory from which it came and how the sausage was made by this or that particular historian. In other words, not all sausage is created equal, and neither are all the historical works that are made available to us online or at the bookstore. And yet we too often view these historical works with an uncritical veneration simply because they were published and showed up on the bookshelf. This tendency to venerate the published or written word is not limited to historical works alone, but to almost any nonfiction book on the internet or in the library, such as science or medical books. Later we will delve into this dangerous tendency to venerate published historical books, but for now, let us turn to the second of our 4 questions. Another common question that we are often presented with is this: why all the fuss about church history, and why the emphasis on understanding historicity? First off, we are faced with the claim by post-Mormons that we know your religion and your history better than you do, giving them the supposed advantage or upper hand over those Latter-day Saints who may or may not be as familiar as they are with the early life of Joseph Smith and the historical origins of the church. It is this general lack of keeping up with the current trends in church history that has led to the red pilling of the Latter-day Saints, wherein unsuspecting members of the church are caught off guard by historical facts that they were not at all familiar with, and who are then pressured by these startling facts and often troubling accusations into choosing between remaining in blissful ignorance of our historical past or experiencing a full-fledged faith crisis wherein one abandons one's testimony and one's faith and quits the church. The second thing we need to keep in mind as to why all the fuss about church history is that post-Mormons believe that Mormon historicity is Mormonism's Achilles heel. And this has led to what we referred to in earlier episodes as post-Mormonism's red pill drill down, wherein post-Mormons strategize that the best way to take down the church is by debunking the church's historical and foundational truth claims. It is this attempted drill down or takedown of the church that has created all the fuss about church history in general and Mormon historicity in particular. What we are faced with then are 2 opposing and polarizing historical narratives, both claiming historical authenticity, and this is where historicity as an academic discipline comes to the forefront. After all, historicity is all about the pursuit of historical authenticity, and whichever side can lay claim to this historical authenticity and this imaginary seal of approval is to be viewed the winner in this winner-take-all struggle between post-Mormon historicity and Mormon historicity. Think of it this way: if post-Mormon antagonists, with their faith-pouncing historical narratives, can lay claim to this imaginary and highly coveted historical authenticity seal of approval, then, in their minds, they win. On the other hand, Mormon apologists, with their faith-promoting historical narratives, can lay claim to this imaginary and highly coveted historical authenticity seal of approval, then, in their minds, they win. And it is this winner-take-all mentality, or battle or struggle for historical authenticity, that has made Mormon historicity ground zero for any attack or defense of the legitimacy of the church, and explains why all the fuss in our day about church history and historicity as an academic discipline. It is our argument that this winner-take-all mentality, struggle, or battle by both sides over this imaginary and highly coveted historical authenticity seal of approval is but the worship of a false idol, and in line with the false worship and exaggerated claims of scientism and historicism. The point is that while the pursuit of historical authenticity is an ideal to be praised and sought after, it is not a golden calf to fall down before and to be worshipped, for the simple reason that historicity as an academic discipline is itself faced with numerous academic concerns, difficulties, and stumbling blocks in the realm of historical research. To show you what I am referring to, let me give one recent example of an historical document in the political realm that most everyone is familiar with and which had potentially huge implications for the legitimacy of a presidential election in both 2008 and 2012. The historical document I am referring to is Barack Obama's birth certificate, which clearly shows Obama born in Honolulu, Hawaii in 1961, making him eligible to run for the presidency of the United States in 2008 and 2012 as a natural-born citizen. It should also be noted that while this historical document contained numerous historical data points, including his name, sex, date of birth, time of birth, and so forth, the only historical data points of interest in this case were the date of his birth, the city, county, and state of birth, and the signatures of a parent, an attendant, and of a local registrar at the bottom of the document, certifying its authenticity. All of this, of course, could be fake, phony, and false, and so it was important that this historical document be scrutinized by experts and by those in authority for its historical authenticity, and thereby receive in the eyes of the world this imaginary and highly coveted historical authenticity seal of approval. Many so-called right-wing conspiracy theorists disputed the historical authenticity of this birth certificate, particularly when a second birth certificate from Kenya appeared on the internet with its own imaginary historical authenticity seal of approval, suggesting Barack Obama was not a natural-born citizen of the United States and was therefore ineligible to run for President of the United States. Now, regardless of what you might think about the merits of such arguments, these contrary and opposing historical documents do highlight the problematic, probabilistic, and provisional nature of historical documents and of historicity as an academic discipline. Historicity, or the pursuit of historical authenticity, is problematic because it is subject to error. It is probabilistic because it is subject to a sliding scale of being more or less probable, and it is provisional because it is subject to change. Obviously, one or the other, or perhaps even both of these historical documents or birth certificates, may be and could be forgeries put in play for political reasons. The point is that any historical authenticity seal of approval proclaimed by this or that expert is itself suspect to further investigation, and is by itself no foolproof guarantee that this historical authenticity has finally been achieved. In other words, among other things, there is the very real problem of human errors, probabilistic calculations, outright forgeries, and thus the provisional nature of the entire enterprise. In short, there are so many diverse ways that historicity as an academic discipline can go wrong, or an academic paper or project can go sideways, that these possibilities alone should temper this winner-take-all mentality for historical authenticity. Again, while the pursuit of historical authenticity is an ideal to be praised and sought after, it is not a golden calf to fall down before or to be worshipped and fought over as the supreme prize or god of historians or other interested parties. For historical authenticity becomes a false idol whenever it is not properly tempered and ought to be viewed as such by all of us. The third question that may come to mind in our day is this: why not inoculate all the Latter-day Saints from this post-Mormon induced faith crisis by simply turning us all into church history buffs? One solution, then, for inoculating the Latter-day Saints from this post-Mormon induced faith crisis is to encourage every Latter-day Saint to become a church history buff by exposing themselves to all the historical literature available, whether pro or con. The idea is it is difficult to red pill a Latter-day Saint if they are already familiar with and have been exposed to all the latest literature. This means being exposed not just to the often one-sided faith-promoting historical narratives of the Latter-day Saints, but also the equally one-sided faith-pouncing historical narratives of the post-Mormons as well. But it is our opinion that it is not enough for Latter-day Saints to be or to become church history buffs in this all-encompassing or all-embracing sense by reading everything they can get their hands on, for the simple reason that the veneration paid and the cognitive dissonance created by these opposing and polarizing historical works could be blinding. And so, something more than becoming church history buffs is needed. Let me explain why. Even as church history buffs, our ignorance of the problematic nature of historicity as an academic discipline leaves us in a very vulnerable position. For the moment we pick up and read through a well-written and well-documented historical work, we'll find ourselves not only captivated, but concluding to ourselves that if it's that well-written and documented, it must be true. For example, as we read through the text of an historical work, we'll often find ourselves saying, "Wow, is that true?" And then we'll immediately turn to all the notes and cited sources at the back of the book to verify it, and with the overwhelming impression that with all this documentation, it must be true. All of which combines together to give the reader the false assurance that historical authenticity has indeed been achieved, and that the historical narrative that one is being presented with is not only factually true and reliable, but beyond repute. The question is, of course, is this documentation proof of historical authenticity, or is it simply proof of a great deal of historical research, or a mixture of both? The point is that a well-documented historical work or narrative has a powerful influence upon the mind of the reader, particularly when one makes no distinction between history as an historical narrative and historicity in the quest of historical authenticity. It is here, then, at this vulnerable point, that an understanding of history as against historicity is most needed. As an example of an impressive historical work with equally impressive documentation, let us refer to Richard L. Bushman's work, Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling. When reading through this historical work on the life of Joseph Smith, one will catch oneself stopping in the middle of your read and saying, "Wow, is that true?" And then you'll also find yourself quickly turning to the back of the book while thinking to oneself that with all this documentation in place and all these sources cited, it must be true. After all, in this particular historical work, there are 100 pages of page notes, with probably close to 2,000 individual notes, as well as 50 pages of cited sources, meaning there could be as many as 1,000 different sources cited. The point is, who wouldn't be impressed? And yet, the question that one should ask oneself is along these lines. Is all this documentation by itself absolute proof of historical authenticity? Of course, the answer is no. Now, it is true that all the documentation is certainly evidence of a great deal of painstaking historical research in the quest for historical authenticity. But by itself, it is no guarantee that this historical authenticity has been achieved. In other words, regardless of how well written, researched, and highly recommended this historical work is, it is still cooked sausage, made up of sausage that came out of the historian's own sausage factory. Again, it's not enough for Latter-day Saints to become church history buffs, for without an understanding of historicity and its problematic nature, that is, without at least a minimal understanding of all that can go wrong in the sausage factory, in the making of the sausage, one will remain vulnerable to this double notion that all sausage is created equally, and that a published and well-documented historical work is all the proof one needs of its historical authenticity. Yes, historicity as an academic discipline is all about the pursuit of historical authenticity. But as every health inspector knows, a lot can go wrong in a sausage factory. And this leads us back to the precautionary measures or warnings which must be put in place to assure that the cooked sausage we are enjoying is truly grade A or of the highest quality, and not carrying a harmful or deadly bacteria. So no, it's not enough for Latter-day Saints to simply become church history buffs. For in addition, we must have at least a minimal understanding of historicity and its problematic nature in order to effectively inoculate ourselves and our families from this post-Mormon-induced faith crisis. This takes us to the last question in this episode, and which will be of particular interest to those who are puzzled by the vacant and unconcerned reaction of a great many Latter-day Saints to these episodes on Unmasking Postmormonism and the Faith Crisis Movement. The question that we want to ask is, why are many Latter-day Saints not concerned with postmormonism or its attack on church history? To address this question, let's begin by first making a general observation about what matters most to this or that Latter-day Saint when it comes to their various testimonies, personal ties, and religious commitments to the church. It has been stated that when it comes to the church and what matters most in the minds, hearts, and lives of Latter-day Saints, that not all members of the church think alike. In other words, what matters most to one Latter-day Saint is not always what matters most to another. Even spouses, teenage and adult children, and other family relatives may differ greatly, but it has been pointed out that in our day, and as a broad generalization, there are but 3 different types of responses to this question of what matters most. Some have referred to these 3 types of saints as validity saints, utility saints, and equity saints. Let me explain. Validity saints are those members of the church who view truth issues as of first and foremost importance when it comes to the various testimonies, personal ties, and religious commitments to the church and to the restored gospel. By truth issues, they mean historical and foundational truth claims made by the church and upon which their testimonies are built, such as Joseph Smith truly being a prophet of God, the Book of Mormon truly being the Word of God, and this church truly being the one true church upon the earth. In short, they view the validity of their personal testimonies as being dependent upon the validity of these historical and foundational truth claims. If these historical and foundational truth claims do not hold up, then neither do their testimonies, and that is all there is to it. Anything else the church may do on a personal, family, social, or community level is rendered irrelevant and meaningless if it is not, first and foremost, what it claims to be. Utility saints are those members of the church who hold value issues to be of first and foremost importance in their lives when it comes to their personal testimonies, ties, and commitments to the church and to the restored gospel. By value issues, they mean the promotion of family and community values, such as the nuclear family, loving one's neighbor, dealing honestly, and promoting a peaceful, moral, and prosperous environment to raise one's family within. In short, they view the utility or good that the church and the restored gospel does in the world and in their own lives as being of first and foremost importance, even more so than its truthfulness. In other words, futility saints, even if it happened to be that the church was false on an historical and foundational truth claim level, one would still claim that it works for me, and one would go on living one's life as if it were true. And with such a mentality and attitude, one could still go on enjoying all the goodness and blessings of the gospel just the same. Equity saints are a rather recent and growing category of Latter-day Saints, particularly among the young adults and rising generation. These are those members of the church who are sensitive not so much to the historical and foundational truth claims of the church, or to the utilitarian aspects of organized religion, but are instead keenly aware of fairness issues, of treating each other in a fair and impartial manner, regardless of one's race, sex, gender preference, religious affiliation, cultural mores, or any other personal or cultural identity markers. For many of these equity saints, historical and foundational truth claims, moral standards, and religious orthodoxy are seen as little more than personal preferences or matters of taste, which are far too subjective and relative to be taken seriously or to waste one's time quarreling over, particularly when there is so much pain and suffering in the world. In short, equity saints are more cause-oriented than gospel-oriented, and have little patience for or interest in organized religion, unless, of course, it too is engaged in reducing the enormous pain and suffering that they see in the world. In summation, then, for validity saints, what matters most are foundational truth claims, while for utility saints, what matters most are family ties and family values. And besides, they often argue, truth issues are matters of faith and not fact. And finally, for equity saints, what matters first and foremost is social justice as a political, social, and egalitarian form of equity, wherein being fair, impartial, and non-judgmental means equality of results and not merely equality of opportunity. The middle way, which equity saints are so fond of espousing, is simply code for not wanting to be bothered by organized religion, or to be boxed in by religious orthodoxy, for theirs is a live and let live mentality. The reason for pointing out these three types of responses to what matters most is because this series of episodes on unmasking postmormonism and understanding historicity will be of interest primarily to those whom we are designating as validity saints, to those who hold that what matters most when it comes to our various testimonies, personal ties, and religious commitments to the Church are its historical and foundational truth claims. Again, validity saints will insist that if the Church's historical and foundational truth claims do not hold up, then neither do our testimonies, and that is the bottom line for them. Again, anything else the Church may do on a personal, family, social, or community level is rendered irrelevant and meaningless if it is not, first and foremost, what it claims to be. In the next episode, we will take you inside the sausage factory for a closer look at all the moving parts and potential pitfalls of historicity as an academic discipline in the pursuit of historical authenticity. Before ending this episode, let us once again put a plug in for our course on eternalism by encouraging you to visit our website at christianeternalism.org. In the search for explanations of the gospel, writes Elder John A. Witzel, truth must be the first and last concern. Whatever is untrue or doubtful must be cast aside. Only that which has stood and can stand the light of truth should be retained. Elsewhere he writes, the search for truth is, therefore, our first and highest duty. We find these two quotes to be particularly relevant when it comes to our discussion of what matters most, or as to what ought to matter most, in the minds and hearts of the Latter-day Saints.